All right then. This is a little short program on how to deal with those pesky inputs uh, and people breaking them. I use the scanner a lot, and unfortunately, if you type in something that it's not looking for, it will break and cause a input mismatch exception. The whole program will crash. If I'm looking for an integer, I type in a string, it will see it's not the same and explode. Your program ends. So in order to stop that, we can write a little bit of code, and there's two ways you can do this. So at the beginning, I go ahead and I have a scanner, and I call this project breaking inputs. My date's a little old, but you can see. Now, I set up my scanner, and I have this Boolean check equals false. This is going to be a little intro into while loops 2 as well. But so this right here, while not check. Basically what that means is basically it's while check is false. And I could write while check equals false. While check does not equal true. Uh, all three of those statements are the same thing. Now, there is something called a try-catch. What a try-catch does is if there's an error that would crash your program, this will catch it and then display whatever message you need. In this case, I've added a loop to it. Now, if I don't have a loop, which I can show you here, doot, doot, if I take out the loop, this will run one time, print a message, and then it'll just move on to the next. If I add this loop, though, it's going to force me to stay here until I type in a number. Now, I will try to do this code here. And it says type in a number, int number equals input.nextInt. Check is true. Now, once this is true, this while loop's going to stop. Right now it says while it's false, keep looping over and over and over again. Now, this is basically an if statement. If it's true, this runs. Else, it goes to this catch exception and does whatever code is in there. In this case, that's not a number noob. Check is going to be assuredly set to false, and then this loop's going to continue. Now I have this input.nextLine here because when you type in an int and you press enter, it tends to screw some things up later. This kind of clears the input. There's a couple other ways to do that. That's just one of the ways I do it. So basically what happens is if I type in a number, it will hooray and where you typed in a number. If I don't, it will keep me here until I do. This is one way, the try catch. And it's a little lengthy as you can see. The shorter way is just to use an if statement. I type in a second number, and you see I have this if input dot has next. Now, what that does is basically input dot has next int is going to wait for me to type something in. I type it in. So I'm actually waiting right here. Now, if it's an int, this is going to be true. It's going to run this. It's going to take that integer. Input.nextInt takes the next integer on the stream, the input stream, and I'm just going to plug it into this number here. Now, if it's not true, it will say that's not a number. So if I type in Bob, well, input.hasNextInt is either true or false. Well, Bob is not an int, so it's going to be false, which means it's not going to go ahead and try to put a string into an int, which is what crashes your program. It'll ignore that and go to the print statement. So let's take a look and see how this runs. My first one is the loop. It tells me to type in a number. Bob. That's not a number. Greg. Mr. Saturn. 9001. That's a number. Now, the second time, Bob. That's not a number. So, Bob, on my try catch, ends up throwing an exception because Bob going into here throws an input mismatch exception. It gets caught, and I run this statement instead, which keeps my loop false and makes me loop again. That's one of the big purposes of loops. I can stay here until basically it all ends. Second time I type Bob, it went here. Well, Bob is not an integer, so that's a false. And if this ends up being false, it goes to the else. That's not a number. I run it again, type in 12. I type in 9001, and it's a number. And that's pretty quick, simple tutorial on how to prevent the scanner specifically. And you could use this with JOptionPay and a couple of other things from breaking your program and crashing it.